Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're building a massive, comprehensive study guide covering the dramatic transformation of America from 1865 to 1900. We're talking about a defining era of United States history, one that's completely packed with sweeping constitutional changes, intense political pushback, and the rapid expansion of the nation's borders. So if you're studying for an exam or just want a really clear, structured understanding of how the modern U.S. took shape after the Civil War, you are in the exact right place. Grab your notes and let's jump right in.
Let's start with a huge question to kind of frame your notes. How exactly did the United States go from amending the Constitution for absolute equality to actively enforcing widespread segregation? It's a profound contradiction, right? The nation tried to rebuild itself based on those founding principles of liberty and justice, but the application of those principles was fiercely contested. Keep this tension in the back of your mind as we go through the material today.
Okay, here is our agenda for the study guide. First, rebuilding a broken nation. Then, the Compromise of 1877, westward expansion and assimilation, the immigrant experience, and finally, the fight for women's suffrage. Let's kick things off with Section 1, Rebuilding a Broken Nation.
All right, if you're making flashcards for an exam, you absolutely need to know our first essential term, Reconstruction. This was the era immediately following the Civil War when the U.S. government tried to physically and politically rebuild the South and reunite a deeply, deeply fractured country. And this wasn't just about repairing roads or bridges. It was about integrating formerly enslaved African Americans into society as free citizens. To give you an idea of the sheer scale here, this meant completely restructuring the lives and legal status of roughly 4 million newly freed people.
During this period, the government actually made a massive swing forward. Driven largely by radical Republicans in Congress, they managed to pass 3 monumental amendments. The 13th Amendment officially abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment granted citizenship to everyone born in the U.S., which importantly included formerly enslaved people. And the 15th Amendment protected voting rights for black men. On top of that, Congress created the Freedmen's Bureau. This was a vital federal agency that stepped in to provide food, build schools, and offer legal support to help formerly enslaved people adjust to freedom and build independent lives.
But, as things often go, the high-minded intent of these federal laws clashed violently with the harsh realities on the ground. The federal government really wanted to enforce constitutional rights and political participation. Initially, they even used the military to do so, but white Southerners actively worked to reassert their control. They passed restrictive black codes to severely limit the rights of African Americans. White supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan used horrific violence to terrorize black voters and literally stop political participation. Ultimately, all of this resistance paved the way for Jim Crow laws, which legally required racial segregation in public places.
Which brings us to Section 2, the Compromise of 1877.
This is the pivotal turning point of our explainer. To resolve the highly disputed presidential election of 1876, politicians made an explicit trade-off. On one side, Rutherford B. Hayes is granted the presidency. But in exchange for the White House, he agrees to a massive concession. Federal troops are officially removed from the South. Without the military there to enforce those new constitutional amendments and actually protect African American citizens, the federal government effectively just surrendered its oversight of the region.
So, this single political compromise literally ripped the rug out from under all the progress we just talked about. By withdrawing those troops, the Compromise of 1877 marked the absolute end of Reconstruction. It practically gave Southern states a green light to rapidly reverse the civil rights gains African Americans had fought so incredibly hard to achieve. Once the troops left in 1877, this really tragic momentum began. In 1883, the Supreme Court's civil rights cases made it vastly easier for private businesses to legally discriminate. And this whole rollback climaxed in 1896 with the infamous Plessy v. Ferguson decision. The Supreme Court officially legalized racial segregation under the doctrine of separate but equal. Of course, in reality, facilities were never equal. This decision legally rubber-stamped decades of widespread discrimination in schools, transportation, and public spaces all across the country.
Now let's shift gears to Section 3, Westward Expansion and Assimilation.
Zooming out from the North-South dynamic for a second, the federal government was simultaneously encouraging massive, rapid expansion out west. They fueled this through some really key legislation. The Homestead Act offered free land to settlers. All you had to do was live on it and improve it. Then you had the Pacific Railway Act, which helped fund the construction of a transcontinental railroad, drastically connecting the country. But the big takeaway here is that while these laws fueled incredible economic growth and opportunity for white settlers, it came at the direct expense and destruction of Native American cultures and lands. This entire era of conflict culminated tragically in the 1890 Wounded Knee Massacre, which effectively ended major Native resistance to U.S. expansion.
Here's another vital definition you need for your study guide: the Dawes Act of 1887. This wasn't just about taking land, it was a devastating legislative tool used to force cultural assimilation. The Dawes Act aimed to force Native Americans to live like white Americans, specifically by breaking up their communally held tribal lands into individual privately owned plots.
Because assimilation wasn't just some accidental byproduct of expansion. It was a systematic, step-by-step federal process aimed at erasing indigenous identities entirely. Step 1. Break up the communally held tribal lands. Step 2. Force the adoption of white American farming and customs. And Step 3, which is perhaps the most heartbreaking part, target the children. Native American children were sent away to facilities like the Carlisle Indian School, where they were actively forced to abandon their native languages, their traditional clothing, and all their cultural traditions.
Moving on to Section 4, the immigrant experience.
During this period, the intense struggle for rights and resources deeply affected existing populations and new immigrant groups too. Take Mexican Americans living in the Southwest, for example. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ended the Mexican-American War years prior, explicitly promised land rights to Mexicans who suddenly found themselves living in U.S. territory. However, despite these formal treaty promises, the lived reality was starkly different. As the nation aggressively pushed westward, many Mexican Americans systematically lost their land and resources to new settlers.
We also see intense hostility directed at immigrants, especially during economic downturns. This hostility resulted in the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. Make sure you note this down. It was the very first major U.S. law to ban immigration based entirely on nationality. It specifically and severely targeted Chinese workers. And it's a bitter historical irony, because these were the exact same people whose intense labor had literally just helped build the nation's transcontinental railroads under the Pacific Railway Act.
Finally, Section 5, the fight for women's suffrage.
Let's look at how half the population navigated these really restrictive definitions of citizenship. Remember those massive constitutional milestones we discussed back in Section 1? Well, women are completely excluded from both the 14th Amendment's broad citizenship protections and the 15th Amendment's expansion of voting rights. These glaring omissions frustrated activists and sparked massive protests and renewed calls for universal women's suffrage. Leaders like Susan B. Anthony were forced to renew the intense fight for basic voting and property rights. Now, they wouldn't win the national right to vote in this specific era, but their relentless organizing laid the absolute foundation for future successes in the 20th century.
Connecting all these threads, we can basically summarize our entire study guide today like this. Whether it was freedmen in the South fighting against Jim Crow, Native Americans forced into assimilation at the Carlisle School, Mexican Americans losing their treaty lands, Chinese immigrants facing total exclusion, or women fighting for the ballot box, the post-Civil War era was fundamentally defined by diverse, marginalized groups struggling to make the constitutional promises of liberty and equality a reality for everyone, not just a select few.
Which leaves us with one final, absolutely vital question to ponder as you review your notes. We've seen how the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments reshaped the legal landscape, only to be totally undermined by political compromise and prejudice. So, looking at the trajectory of history since 1900, will the constitutional promises of the Reconstruction era ever be fully realized for all people in America? Or is the struggle we study today an ongoing, permanent feature of the American story? Keep that in mind as you study. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.